First, we would like to acknowledge that we are on ancestral lands and traditional territories of the Puget Sound Coast Salish people. There have always been indigenous peoples in spaces that we call home. There will always be. That's by Kay and Sayers Roots, Mutsun Olan activist. And you right now, if you are in Seattle, you are on Duwamish land. We also want to give a labor acknowledgement. We want to recognize that the United States was built off the stolen labor of kidnapped African and enslaved Black people's work, which created the profits that create our nation. We also want to recognize the brown labor currently happening in California across this country. They are working under terrible air quality conditions, with wildfires burning over 1.2 million acres of land, in addition to the pandemic, just to pick strawberries for our smoothies.
Great. So with that said, hello everyone, and welcome back to the second half of Try Day. Take a moment to make yourself comfortable, relax, maybe take in a few slow breaths, reflect on something you want to do after this training to take care of yourself, because we know that we're all carrying so much right now as we're balancing what it looks like to forge meaningful connections with students during this unprecedented time. Maybe you're taking a moment to ground yourself and some of the hopes that you have for yourself and your students this year. There's a lot happening in our world right now, and whatever energy you're bringing to the table is valid. I have so much gratitude to be sharing this time together with you, and appreciate all the ways I see you uplifting students as well as each other across our communities. My name is Nicole. I work with Seattle Public Schools Department of Racial Equity Advancement, but I'm here today with you in my role with the Partnership Committee, which is putting on this training for anti-racist principles and practices for the school year. During the second half of the day, we'll be exploring the ways that we can dismantle racial contracts through healing-centered engagement. Namely, what are the anti-racist principles and practices that we can implement for ourselves and our students to push for a culture of racial justice at our schools and in our classrooms? And how do we recognize the impact of racial and racist contracts we've inherited and reject them to create space that is affirming to the identities of Black and Brown students? Believing that there's a lot of wisdom that is created when diverse members of our school community comes together, the folks we'll be presenting today, which you can see listed on this slide, represent all kinds of positions and perspectives from our system, each one of them valuable. You'll be hearing from each one of these folks as we move forward this afternoon together. We're doing this event live, so the next slide will provide a few tips and reminders for making the most out of the experience. We certainly thank you for your patience as we navigate any hitches in the giddy-up with tech, but together we'll try to make the experience as smooth as possible. So to get us started, these norms for computer use give us a few tips for navigating the session. You'll need a writing utensil and paper, turn on your captions if desired. You should have a Session 2 guiding document in your email. You will use this document throughout today's session. You will also have a small group breakout room link. This was shared by a leader at your building and department. You'll be working with that group throughout this live session as well. Your microphone and camera are not available in an MS Teams event, and we cover these tips in the morning, but if you need a refresher on how to do some of these things, like putting on the closed captioning, you can refer to the session guide and you'll find all the instructions there. I'll give you a moment to open that now. For the rest of our afternoon together, we're going to be spending the first half hour grounding in some common terms and ideas. Then, Veronica and Flordelrio will lead you through a session about what it looks like to bring your personal values into the classroom, as well making space for students to define, express, and explore their personal and cultural values as well. You'll get a little break, and after that, Ray, Laura, and Brandon will be leading you through exercises to explore your personal intersectional identities, as well as making space to get to know and support your students' intersectional identities. You may notice a pattern here, and the pattern is that we'll be exploring these ideas through the lens of what it means for adults and students. We'll also be exploring the ways in which internal anti-racist work that we collectively do as adults impacts the ways that we're able to uplift or affirm students in their identities. So for the next 25 minutes, we'll be exploring some grounding terms and ideas by exploring both the impacts of and remedies to racial contracts. We'll think a little bit about how racial contract shows up in schools through our experiences of racial stress, as well as how healing-centered practices can help us connect to ourselves, our students, and the broader systems of racial justice. And that's me, Nicole Coates, she, her pronouns. I'm Black and half white. And like I said, I'm from the Department of Racial Equity and Advancement. For the next few minutes, we're going to be getting our brains going. I'll also want us to be sitting in a space of openness and empathy as we begin with student voice, because the responsiveness to voices of students of color is at the heart of healing-centered engagement for anti-racist practices. As we fight against the twin pandemics of both systemic racism and COVID-19, we can only create racially just systems by rooting our decision-making in the expressed needs, aspirations, and abilities of our students of color. For this activity, grab your pen and paper, or type if it's easier for you. You'll be listening to 2 poems about the experiences of students of color in school, and writing in response to these questions as you listen. I encourage you to have the reference guide up as you listen to the poem, as it has all these questions listed. These questions are meant to serve as a guide for listening to students as experts of their own experiences, both for the problems and solutions of racist systems and experiences in school. As you listen to the student poems, capture reflections on the following. How do you hear racial contracts and racism showing up in our schools in the student stories? How does the racial contract, racism, impact students academically and social emotionally? What antidotes and alternatives to racial contracts, racism, do you hear in the student stories? And what would school look like if we made these changes? And how do these changes positively impact students academically and social emotionally? Also, because we cannot take ourselves out of the process, the final question for you to reflect on is your feelings about the poems. How do you relate? How do you not relate? What might you feel called to do if these were your students? What would it look like to genuinely value Black and brown voices? As you listen for these things to implement or avoid as you listen, also listen for things to implement or avoid in your own work. You'll also be hearing a lot of concrete strategies, so you may even want to listen for practices that you want to adopt. Going back to the idea of exploring feelings as data is an idea that we're borrowing from Audre Lorde, who, when talking about one feeling, anger, as a source of information, states, "My anger is a response to racist attitudes and to the actions and presumptions that arise out of those attitudes. If your dealings with other women reflect those attitudes, then my anger and your intended fears are spotlights that can be used for growth, in the same way that I have used my learning to express anger for my growth, but for corrective surgery, not guilt." We live in a society founded on racial contracts. So what does this corrective surgery look like? We sometimes repress, dismiss, or ignore feelings, especially about the impact of racial contracts, especially from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, which often only serves to leave racial contracts intact by not addressing the harms they cause. But as you listen, I encourage you to listen for those feeling spotlights, both in yourself and in the poems, about the joy, about the sorrow, about the wholeness of the student voice and experiences, as well as the wholeness of your empathy as you listen. Listen for how you feel, or how students feel, indicate about what could be changed for racial justice in our system. With that said, we will play the 2 poems from Brave New Voices.
My name is Azura Tayabji. I'm 17 years old, and I'm representing Youth Speak Seattle. Black student steps inside her AP class. All eyes on her, feet like anchors, or a taut rubber band, she drags them across the floor, or propels herself too quickly as to not be noticed. She stands out, no matter how she tries to camouflage herself anyway. Ain't nobody here look like her. Ain't nothing here feel like family. This classroom has the same demographic as the audience to a lynching, and she is the main event. Inconvenience, exception to the rule, she will learn here, but it will burn. For a test score brands her like a cattle prod. She opens her textbook and outmarches a colonizer, wraps his ghost white fingers around her wrists, and they become shackled again. Columbus conquers her, and curriculum lauds itself for discovering her intelligence. Really, it's just been pacified. See, Black students know silence well. It's handcuffs to our desk chair. It's blue juvie jumpsuit. It's knowing the answer but not raising our hand, fearing the punishment for being too smart for our own skin. It's being smothered by statistic after statistic of our failure, the nagging that we should be something better. When did Black kids learn silence? Was it a teacher saying being a lawyer was unrealistic for us? That we could only reach as far as to set the master's table but never sit at it? Did Black kids learn silence, picking at our inconvenient brown as if to peel it off like cake dirt? White teacher saying ain't no word, making my own tongue unfamiliar to me like trash, clogging a disposal only meant to swallow scraps and never speak. Black kids learn silence when whites only signs re-manifested themselves on our classroom doors, clung to our throats like a dreaded reminder: if you speak, it better be not as threatening as you look. It better be the right answer. It better be the wrong answer. It better be a book report on the people that owned your ancestors. Black kids learned silence from a juvenile detention facility across the street from a college, and knowing which one we're more likely to find ourselves in, from the cops in our classrooms and our textbooks. One time, I asked my white woman teacher to please stop interrupting me, and she said I attacked her. There is no possible way to be innocent in this skin. It speaks before I have a chance to. Paints me dangerous, guilty, failure in court and in school. Innocence and opportunity are indulgences Black kids are never granted. We are forced to navigate systems only built to contain us, keep our heads low and our descent lower. Surviving as Black and a child in this world is the hardest assignment and sentence to live out. One day, Black students will get the same scores as their white peers on a corporate test, and racism will become a school board's memory. Fixing the achievement gap will become a victory tucked away in some portfolio, and they'll be satisfied with assimilation. But my classmate said her biggest motivator for coming to school is our Black Studies class. Black students succeed when we are more than a statistic. Black students succeed when our history comes alive to raise their fists with us. Black students succeed when we look at our teachers and see faces like ours, walk down halls that feel more sanctuary than prison. When test scores and Eurocentric standards do not define us, school should be like a family with no bars and no silence. Then nothing would hold us back.
Now, take a moment just to let the words of the poem sink in with you. Take a moment to review your notes and reflect on what you heard. Think of the school day, including what it looks like in the virtual space. What do these things look like in action? Who across our community is involved? Take a moment to write down all of the people who are involved in shaping these experiences, both negative and positive. I'll give you a few seconds to write some of these folks down. Who at your school, in your broader community, across your district, in Seattle in general, is involved in these stories? What types of impacts can they have? What roles do they play? Include as many different roles as you can. So the reason why we have you listing all these people is because this is what systems change looks like. We have different impacts and different roles and different responsibilities, but we all impact student experiences through their education, and we have to move together in the same direction in order to undo the racist legacies we've inherited to support Black, Brown students, families, and staff. The direction we move in has to be led and informed by what Black and brown students are saying about how they experience their education and what would feel affirming to them. To understand the solutions, we have to make space for their voices and remove obstacles. This isn't just about individual actions or just about systems. It's about how individuals across our system can learn and grow together to create collective change for racial justice. The internal work we do translates to the anti-racist work that we do in our role for students. The inverse is also true. The relationship, these racially inequitable systems impact what we're able to accomplish as individuals. So we have to be mindful about how we shape our systems to invite students of color to share their authentic aspirational selves, or how the systems based on racial contracts may construct this. This is an important relationship we'll be exploring today, so let's dig a little bit more into this relationship. You'll notice this graphic here from the National Equity Project shows us the lenses of systemic oppression, which outlines individual, interpersonal, and systemic racism. This Venn diagram outlines the different places that racism lives and where we should be looking at it. In our beliefs on the individual level, in our interactions on the interpersonal level, and in our policies, structures, and institutions on the systemic level. It also outlines the chain reaction that either perpetuates or interrupts racism, and how one thing leads to another. What we think and feel about racial contracts as individuals impact how we do our work, what we consider normal, and how we interact with others. Systems are also simply accumulations of people, their actions, and the policies they create. So all of these interpersonal interactions add up to create our systems. To complete the cycle, systems then impact what we think and how we interact with each other, and can help or hinder our work for anti-racism as a result. All these things are connected, and we need to think of how these forms are related and inform each other if we want to leverage these relationships to dismantle racial contracts. We can sum it up as a question. What opportunities do we have to grow, both individually and collectively, in order to dismantle racial contracts and support students of color in our schools? We may not have everything in our control, but we may still find opportunities to advance racial equity in the roles we have. We're going to dive into a few concepts that will help us explore the skills to advance racial equity from self to system and from system to self. We've already touched on a few of these skills in our initial activity with the student voice and poetry. We've practiced listening to and centering the experiences of students of color, as well as the wisdom in their diagnosis of the problem and solutions. We've also explored Audre Lorde's idea of paying attention to the emotional response to racial injustice, including our own, since feelings can be a check engine light for the existence and persistence of racial inequities and racial contracts in our system. The last point relates to our next concept, racial stress, a term explored by Howard Stevenson, writer of the book Promoting Racial Literacy in Schools, and director of Forward Promise, an organization dedicated to promoting the health and well-being of boys of color. Racial stress is the emotional overload or shock to an individual's coping system before, during, and after racial interactions. It can vary in types, degree, and severity, and occurs every time there is a racial impact from racism and the racial contract. It is a byproduct of racial contracts and racial inequity. It can be a rational response to racial injustice, or a defensive response, perhaps protecting the racial injustice rooted in bias. It can also be a response of not knowing how to address racism when we see it happening. It might look different for all of us, but because we all live in a racialized society, we all experience it. It can sound like feelings of exclusion for students of color. It can sound like a family of color that feels regularly misunderstood. It can sound like a white staff member feeling embarrassed about a racial mishap, but staying quiet or getting defensive because they're not sure how to respond. Or a staff member of color enduring insensitive comments from her colleagues without support. Howard D. Stevenson describes it as the elephant in the room because when we experience racial stress, often the response is to think that if we ignore it, it'll just go away, all while it's sitting right there. We may not always know how to talk about it, but not talking about it makes the situation worse, and in fact leaves the racist system intact. Not talking about the elephant doesn't make it going away. It doesn't make it go away. Instead, we can get better at recognizing racial stress, naming racial stress, building our skills to talk about racial stress, and working in partnership with Black and brown students, families, and staff in our school communities to address the negative impacts of racism. When we track racial stress in our schools, we can start to locate where racism is happening and where it needs to be addressed. We often avoid talking about the elephant because it's stressful and maybe we don't know how, but when we don't talk about it, we miss an opportunity to meaningfully address racism in our system. Noticing and being willing to talk about it is the first essential step. Or as Howard Stevenson says, learning to see and resolve racial stress and conflicts in relationships involves explicit teaching of practices of racial literacy skills and how not to get played by the larger game of racial inferiority. So throughout our session, we're going to be talking about some of those explicit strategies. That brings us to our next concept. What are the things that we can help us become more comfortable with listening for and naming racial stress and racial inequities? What are the skills that can help us make space for the skills, assets, and abilities of students of color, affirming their experiences, abilities, and excellence? We've heard the term social-emotional learning from Dina Simmons, Assistant Director of the Yale Emotional Intelligence School. And she also explores the idea of social-emotional equity, how we can leverage SEL skills for students, staff, and others to address, confront, and remedy the existence of racial equity for students. She explains that social-emotional learning skills can help us build communities that foster courageous conversation across difference so our students can confront injustice, hate, and inequity. SEL skills refers to the life skills that support people in expressing, managing, and expressing emotions, making sound decisions, and fostering interpersonal relationships. These skills seamlessly lend themselves to preventing violence and to building a more peaceful world. Skills like relationship skills, self-awareness, and social awareness can make us more comfortable with naming and addressing racial stress in ourselves and in our systems, as well as opening up more opportunities to invite skills, interests, and abilities for students in our classrooms. With that said, she also says, when SEL is taught to students, particularly students of color, without any context, it can become inherently problematic. What's the point of teaching children conflict resolution skills, she says, if we're not talking about the conflict that exists because of racism or white supremacy? Without that nuance, she says SEL risks turning into white supremacy with a hug. With this note, we need to make sure that when we're practicing self and social awareness, we also need to make sure that we don't use these practices to silence reasonable frustration at injustice, but instead use them to explore what injustice looks like and what the solutions to them are. We have to understand these skills in a broader context of racial injustice and racial contracts, and use them in service of advancing justice for students in our schools. Dina Simmons also shares, if we do not equip young people to confront inequity, they will grow up to be adults who are unable to identify racism, bias, and their complicity in oppressive structures. Howard Stevenson mentions that while we were taught how to not talk about race and racism, we certainly are often not given the same skills to talk about racism. Learning to talk about racism for ourselves is the first step in ensuring that our students are equipped with these skills as well. We certainly know that we have brilliant and essential things to learn from our students, and so we all have an opportunity to think about how that self-work can translate into creating spaces where students can share their authentic selves as well. So our final skill, we have Zaretta Hammond with a helpful reminder. You should be familiar with her from Culture Responsive Teaching in the Brain. You can never take yourself out of the equation. You must commit to the journey. This means that we each must do the inside-out work required, developing the right mindset, engaging in self-reflection, checking our implicit biases, practicing social-emotional awareness, and holding an inquiry stance regarding the impact of our interactions with students. She also says, as you begin your own inside-out work in this area, your lizard brain will start to freak out. It's afraid that you'll have to talk about the sensitive issues such as race, racism, classism, sexism, or any kind of ism. It is afraid that this conversation will make you vulnerable and open to some sort of emotional or physical attack. But this fear is not real. It is just your amygdala's ploy to get you to stay in your comfort zone. Some of us have a lot of practice in race conversations, so having these conversations feel natural to us. For Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, we often have to learn these skills for our own survival in these systems. Other of us are new to these conversations, haven't had to talk about race, or perhaps in a situation where we still feel unsure of our voice. There's a lot of reasons why fear of these conversations might show up, but if we don't push through that fear, we'll miss an opportunity to help shift our system to one where working towards racial justice is the norm. And when we allow the fear and racial stress to win, racism and the harm it can create is allowed to proliferate. We've already explored a couple of skills to help us in this journey. We've practiced naming how racism impacts us, listening to the voices of students of color, explored the connection between ourselves and our systems for racial justice, naming and addressing racial stress, and leveraging social emotional equity for Skills for Racial Justice. We're about to have a quick stretch break, and after that, you'll get some activities that will help with that self-work, which can translate into the work that we do supporting our students and supporting bringing more of their racial and cultural identities in the classroom in informing ways. And before we dive in, here are a few norms that will help us as we engage in our conversations with our colleagues today. The first set of the norms are for adults, and these principles are for balancing power and conversations based on the work of Dr. Kenneth Hardy. Our power and privilege, or lack thereof, can impact how we show up in these conversations. So these tips are to help us think about how the racial contract might even show up in our conversations together and how to interrupt it when it shows up. So these norms are... Okay, so to get into those norms, the first one, we need to be mindful about power and privilege in racial relationships. The second one, whiteness, the centrality of whiteness, and the possession of white skin are assigned considerable power and privilege in our society. Third, the group that has the greatest power or privilege in the conversation ultimately has the greatest responsibility to the relationship. Fourth, reflection and self-interrogation are critical. Fifth, self in relationship to others. And in this concept, this means that as we are reflecting on ourselves, we are also thinking about the experiences and perspectives of the people in front of us. And finally, if you experience marginalization, part of your responsibility is to take care of yourself, practice self-interest, empathy, and centering the importance of your feelings. When we're thinking about our conversations about students specifically, here are some norms to think about how we talk about the students that we're serving. Oh, it looks like that slide is missing, but they're the foundational principles from School Talking for Racial Equity from Michael Pollack, and those principles are that our conversations should convey an equal belief in all young people's equal human value and potential, and a care and respect for their development and well-being. The second one is that our conversation should describe young people more accurately as individuals and members of opportunities, including their experiences in other opportunity contexts. So thinking about students in the wholeness of their identity. The third point is that our conversations should pinpoint and collectively address student needs precisely, not vaguely, and regularly, not rarely. This means that we need to truly get to know our students and be responsive to the needs that they're telling us they have. And finally, share opportunities to learn widely and not with some. That's why we're having this conversation as a community, so we can think about all of the different ways that we impact our students' experiences in our system. And so with all that said, we have a stretch break.
At this time, please follow along with the video, stretch that tech away. We've been asking you to be on your computers for a long time. We want you to get a little bit of movement in your bodies, so follow along with the video.
Look at your neck, what a mess, so tight. Let's relax it. Okay, side to side, keep breathing deep. And again, don't overdo it. But don't twist your shoulders. Just think about your neck and feel the stretch as you look around as far as you can. Now, let's go deeper. Put your hands interlocked on the back of your head. Don't push down. Your neck is very sensitive. Just let the weight of your hands do the work for you. Let's do it again. We are going up and then down. Okay, let's relax the face. Make a very small little face. Now make it big. Oh, big face. Now, little monkey face, little. Now, big face. Okay, let's stretch the heart to get rid of your neck. Try to just push your chin back. This one is good to do against the wall. Where is your double chin? Let me see it now. Where is it? Keep breathing deep. Okay. Thank you for giving yourself this minute. You deserve it. Your body will thank you. stretch the tech away.
Welcome back. My name's Veronica Pugh.
Hi there, my name is Flordelrio Correa, and I go by Flordelrio.
And in this section, we will be talking about our core values and how they can help us build equitable, socially just community in our classrooms that also uses healing practices and anti-racist practices. We will identify our core values, acknowledge the barriers that are standing in the way of practicing them. We'll help you get to know your audience of your enemies, allies, accomplices, stretch or sabotage our weaknesses regarding racial stress. We'll begin to bankrupt your privilege. We'll plan ways to use core values, bringing social justice in the classroom by implementing your core values in the classroom for the sake of racial justice. All right. My name's Veronica Pugh is she, her. I'm African American. I am a paraprofessional at Arbor Heights Elementary.
Hi again, my name is Flordelrio. I'm a Chicana. I represent the interagency Grey Wolves. Shout out Grey Wolves! My ancestors guide me, and we will lead you through this work, and we are going to guide you through this work with joy and positivity and love. Get into it.
Why are we doing this work? If I'm not willing to talk about myself, my students aren't going to be willing to talk about themselves. Thinking about our students who don't trust us in the school system, the school, the educators, why? Also, oneself is one's community, and one's community is oneself. We have to look at our role that we play and how that contributes to the environment around us, and how the environment around us is affecting us individually, and what we can do to change that. Core values are influenced by social environments, racial contracts, economic and cultural exposure. So what is a core value? Value, Webster defines value as relative worth, utility, or importance. Value is something such as a principle or quality intrinsically valuable or desirable. Our core values are the foundation of who we are and how you identify your authentic self. We all have them. We're going to identify 3 that are really important to us today, personally, and then you later are going to get to know what your students' core values are once you go back to class. Before you is a list of popular core values. I would like you to take a moment, take that paper or notepad, whatever you're using to write, and pick 3. Pick your top 3 core values. It's okay if you don't see them on the list. For instance, one of mine is determination. Determination's not on this list. I might pick hard work. I might pick self-actualization instead. Or I might just decide, no, I need determination, and write that down. You choose your top 3. Please write them now. I'll give you some time.
So let's just take a moment here. I think there is an amygdala hijack going on in real time here, right? Thank you, everyone, for letting me hijack this presentation real quick, because I just can't sit here anymore with the chat. Let's address the chat, all right? So I just want to talk about how amygdala hijack, it goes both ways, right? Some of us, some of our educators, you'll learn the difference between these words. Some enemies parading themselves as allies and accomplices, right? They're sitting in the virtual room with you, All right, and some of them are dropping things into the chat. So let's be very transparent about that. Some of you are showing who you really are in these comments, yeah? Yeah? And you think no one can see it, okay? We're taking notes and keeping records. Oh, don't you worry, your voice will be heard, all right? But it will be heard in the sense that we need to bankrupt our privilege. Some of us are taking over this chat, and we're really going into this idea of amygdala hijack. For some reason, we cannot wrap our minds around that this work needs to be done, that there has to be a measure, some sort of willing through. So this is not what I wanted to talk about. I have a beautiful script here, right? But we cannot go on as educators, as real people, as humans, until we address this. Some of you are hiding in the comments. You are no longer going to sit in your privilege. Attach your name. My name is Flordelrio Rant. You can comment to me directly. We can have this dialogue. I am here to help us get rid of these barriers. We are here to lift as we climb, not to create more perpetuation of the racial contracts that not one of us created, not one of us wants to have happen to our students, our youth. So if we may please take this moment and reflect on how your core values might be being devalued by what's being put in the chat. We have to be very, very aware of how this tension is bubbling in our. Be aware. Bankrupt your privilege. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you, Flordelrio. And thank you for those who have been patient and are really in it to do this work and are really here to make changes and want to learn. So going back to core values, like Flordelrio said, we're all humans and we all have values. We all have our own social and emotional needs that we need to heal and we need to help. So before we can do that for our students, we need to do it for ourselves. One of those ways is by making sure that we're true to our values. That's why I asked you to write down 3 that are most important to you. Are there some from the list that resonate with you? Why or why not? Think about your cultural and spiritual influences. Does that strengthen or weaken your values? Think about the values that you have at work. Are they the same? Why or why not? Think about your values socially. Are those the same or different from the previous? Do you bring your cultural and spiritual values with you to work? Do you bring your work values with you when you're hanging out at parties? They might change from situation to situation, or they might stay the same. Typically, they stay the same, but we don't bring them with us. Think about when you're in the classroom. Are you putting love into that math? I want you to take some time and journal. What role does your culture play in your values? How have your experiences in school informed these values? Did that change when you were in elementary school, middle school, or high school, or were they all the same? Again, we're thinking about our core values, the ones from the list. What role did those play in your culture? What roles do those play? How has your schooling informed those core values? Take another minute and write. Hold on to those. You're going to revisit them.
ahead and finish up those final thoughts. This is up for those of you who like to read the slide. So as you're finishing your journaling, this is up for those of you who just like to read a little bit ahead. All right, so if this is blurry, just please know these slide decks will be available to you for your own perusal. And thank you so much for hanging in there with us with all this technical difficulties. Shout out to our interpreters, you doing that thing. Yes. All right, here we go. So when we talk about values, right, what does that mean when we talk about our audience? Okay, and how can we start to engage in boundaries in their place? Again, my name is Flordelrio. All right, so first of all, we start with this term here. Let's just be upfront, enemies. All right, we don't need to pad it. We don't need to have coded and loaded language. Enemies. To see you succeed. All right, let that sit there. All right, these are the ones who say that they want to support you, but they would not lift one finger to help you out. And you know what, though? Let's be real here. Okay, calling on to Mother RuPaul. Saboteur that brings upon these insecurities. Right? Shout out to my people from interagency who remind me of W.E.B. Du tied to trauma and spiritual pain, ancestral rage. Right? All right. So what's that transition in there, right? Can an enemy ever get out of that spot? Well, I don't know. I've never seen it personally. Right? So then let's call to these other folks here, right? Who are our allies? And I know we hear these upon the work of Shirley Little, and this is how Shirley defines allies. Allies are individuals there for the season, not the reason. In other words, these folk have their own agenda. We've seen a couple of enemies and a couple of allies in this chat today. Again, my name is Flordelrio. When we talk about accomplices, co-conspirators, right, those are your partners in abolition. These are the individuals who are willing to bankrupt their own privilege, their own positionality to see you shine and win. They're the ones who are okay to say, yeah, man, that might be my role, but today you get to lead because you're the one clearly spent and invested time in this. So you lead, right? Those are our partners. Those are our co-conspirators. Those are the ones we need to pull close to us. See here this meme, right? Maybe it's me. Maybe it's imposter syndrome. But when we talk about stretch or sabotage, the stretch is that encouragement and empowerment, okay? It is a hard place to be when you're stretching yourself, right? Okay? Right? The stretch connects with those who encourage and empower. We confront sabotage from a place of wisdom when we realize that this might be stretching us into a different place, into a different leadership role, right? But we also have to be real here. You got to know your strengths and weaknesses. You got to be able to confront your weaknesses. And in that, we need to create boundaries for those enemies and allies who use too much of our time, those emotional vampires, those people who create a toxic work environment, who claim that you're telling a story when really it is your lived experience. Don't call my lived experience a story. This is where we also want to collaborate with our other accomplices. The most important accomplices, the elders and the youth, speaking to 7 generations before us and the 7 generations beyond us. We also need to be able to have that self-reflection. Some of you, hopefully, are reflecting on what you put in the chat today. The ability to identify your position as in stretching or sabotaging yourself or others. Right? So this is the question here. When someone violates your core values, what are you going to do? Because your body will tell you. You will get anxious. You'll have anxiety. You might get depression. You might go into some vices because what you need, your needs are not being met. And that is how we sometimes self-sabotage ourselves. All right, now, I'm going to be quiet for just a moment. Take that picture, take these notes, and then I'm going to read through this slide. So when we are perpetuating characteristics of white supremacy culture, when we are catering to white fragility, we are engaging in this drama triangle. And these different points of position, these different positionality, oh, they got tags, they got names here. Let's go into them right here. We got the persecutor. Oh, it's all your fault. Why would you make me do this to you? I've heard that before. I've heard that from educators in the Seattle public school system. Their warrant of self-protection. They will criticize the enabling rescuer. We'll talk about them in a moment. These people believe the world is not safe. And for survival, right? We get that. For survival, they've had to hide behind indignant wrath. Okay? And that should say uncaring detachment. All right? They have to protect themselves by using authoritative, controlling, and punitive methods. That's that Karen teacher. That's that Karen out on the street. They do not provide any guidance. They don't provide any assistance or solutions to the problem, but they're good at finding fault in others. Let's go talk about the rescuers now, right? That white savior syndrome, right? Oh, looky here now. I'm just trying to help you. Look how hard I tried for you people, right? Like they are helpers and caretakers. But they need a victim. They need someone to rescue in order for them to feel vital and important. Right? These people apply short-term repair options. They're always harried, tired, physical complaints, right? Because we're taking those manifestations into our body now. Okay? These people get value from what they do for others. Smothering, controlling, manipulative, gaslighting for their own good. Right? Sometimes, rescuers, they want to fix it, right? But then they tend to negate their own needs. And they often guilt trip people into getting their own way. Now we go down to the victim. Oh, but I'm just helpless. I'm hopeless. Man, it must be nice to be able to think the way Flordelrio does. It must be nice. If only I was able to think the same way she would, right? That's some helpless and hopelessness right there. That makes you a martyr. All right? That is you realizing that there are unrealistic expectations or expectations that can't be met. So let's change those expectations. Okay? So these people, we're going to stuff the thoughts down, the feelings, the needs, the wants about the problem, right? But then that builds resentment. And eventually there's that retaliation. But they're going to deny that responsibility, right? The victim role, right? Deny possessing the power to change. They will not take a stand. Okay? This is a cycle which protects characteristics of white supremacy culture and white fragility. We think back between identifying the difference between enemies and allies. Okay, this triangle is where that distinction comes into play. We want to look at this and also understand that we have been part of this cycle before. There is no such thing as a woke supreme. We think back and we consider how we've been part of this cycle, and we have to name the times that we have been Karen teachers. We have kicked students out. How have we protected and perpetuated characteristics of white supremacy culture? Because, sometimes it's easier. Sometimes it's known. Sometimes that's how we were raised. Nah. We want to look here now and how we can change that. How do we empower ourselves, empower the youth, right? What does that flip side look like? When we talk about the empowerment triangle, this is where social, emotional learning, emotional intelligence comes into our professional play. Okay? We have options here. Instead of being a perpetrator, we are open and willing to receive feedback. You always have a choice, and not making a choice is a choice. Okay? Life is not black and white, but there are shades of gray. And I'm not so sure about this word here, but mature options can feel uncomfortable at first. I don't know about that word mature, right? But again, calling back to Shirley Little, whose work this is, right? And this also requires us, these options, understanding you have options, that requires you to activate your boundaries. Okay, then we go into this negotiation space. Instead of a rescuer, you are practicing active listening, right? Empathetic listening, not dismissive listening. You gotta breathe. Think back to those stretches we just did. In this place, there are no winners or losers. We can accept non-closure. We ain't gonna get everything we want. This place takes practice. You gotta be open to receive feedback. You cannot really worry about what others and how others will receive you. You gotta be respectful and honest. And you also, there's a formula down here that can help you with these boundary activations. We'll talk about that assertiveness formula in a moment. All of this going down to your responsibility. Instead of a victim mentality, we're becoming responsible for life and decisions we choose to make. There's no blaming here. And if we don't have the skills to be relational, we are responsible for learning those skills. How can we ask students to do social emotional work, identity work, if we're not willing to do it for ourselves? When we look at this assertiveness formula, right, I want to go through it a little bit. When I heard you say, or when I saw you do data, when that person shares that data with you, that's not a story. That's their lived experience. Don't reduce it to a colloquial thing. It is their life. This is what I think about. So then they're going to share their thoughts. About that, I feel they're going to share their emotions. And guess what? You do not get to decide how you have harmed someone. You get to step back and say, I will do better. In the future, I would request or I would prefer, and then there you put in your vulnerable request. Okay? So when we think about these things, we cannot do this work alone. We all have blind spots and areas where we need to push ourselves outside of what we have always done. You need that accomplice. You need that co-conspirator. And these are available in that session 2 guiding document for you to use at a different time, right? In those individual moments where you check in with your accountability buddy. These are prompts that you can use to check each other and check yourself.
Five-year strategic plan to teach Black excellence. What is Black excellence? If you really know without guessing what it means, Black excellence, don't guess. Only write it if you know. Okay, if you don't. On our school's web or on our district's website, we can read that this work is about changing broken systems and undoing legacies of racism in public education. So let's go with that. We're in a time of COVID. We're teaching online. How many of us have thought, I work at a school, I didn't plan to be behind a computer all day, right? The rules have changed on us. We get to change the rules. Our classrooms look different. We get to set them up however we want to. So let's set them up with healing and anti-racist practices. So what is Black excellence? I'm Black. I'm excellent. I am the embodiment of Black excellence. And no teacher in Seattle Public Schools taught me how to be Black excellence. But they did help me access it. I should say, I am a product of Seattle Public Schools. From cradle to college, from Head Start at High Point to post-baccalaureate at UW, I graduated from Rainier Beach. Them Blacks, you know! And hey, most of the people I talk to from Rainier Beach still are either in education or some social work or some other kind of civil service. So what were those educators doing? We were getting ragged on about how poor our academics were, so it had to be something else that got us all to some post-secondary some post-secondary degree or certificate. Our students are already excellent. Our biopic students are already excellent. They know how to have fun. They know how to learn. They know how to empathize. They know how to be curious. Better than any adult. Our journey as educators in healing and anti-racist practices is to provide a safe and equitable space for them to explore these beautiful qualities. They already know how to use them. We need to help them access it and not murder it. We do not need to murder their spirits. Stop moving and stop talking. Your behavior is unacceptable. Stop laughing. Don't cry. It doesn't matter. Not in my room. Get out. We're going to take some time to explore this in your school groups. We're going to take some time to explore this in your school groups.